want to just say, first of all, okay. I just want to thank everyone, first of all, for coming. I really appreciate you guys, hanging out with us tonight. And thank you for Julie, to Julie for setting all this up. I wanted to kind of make it a little bit of a authentic experience. So I have, little candles kind of lighting me up a little bit. If it's too distracting, please let me know. I can just turn my lights back on if it's weird to have like a disembodied head talking to you tonight. Just like I said, just let me know. So what I want to do, because I know you guys are really here for the ghost stories, right? That's what everybody, wants to do for Halloween. What I do want to do very briefly, though, is to kind of talk about the history of folklore in general, because ghost stories, in a lot of ways, are kind of like a subset of folklore. So I kind of want to talk just very briefly about the history of folklore and why it's important when it comes to storytelling. And kind of why it's endured over the years. And then I want to get into our series of stories. What's neat about this presentation and why I enjoy it is because all of the ghost stories that we'll hear tonight are based in New Jersey. So they're very, very local stories, which is kind of fun. Okay, so some questions that I guess I kind of want you guys to like rhetorically ponder as we go through the presentation and the stories tonight. Think about some of your most favorite movies. Think about your favorite books. Think about your favorite TV shows. And what I want you to kind of think about a little is what draws you to them in the first place. What elements of the movie or the book or the story do you really, really love? And are there certain key elements of your favorites that apply to lots of different books? Are there key themes? Is there something about the main characters that you really enjoy? So kind of think about those as we go through some of these. And ultimately, the third question that I have here at the bottom of the screen is the one that I really kind of want us to focus on the most is, do these stories that we love so much and that we're drawn to, do they serve a purpose more than just entertainment? And that's not to take anything away from entertainment. Entertainment's important. It's fun. It's interesting. It helps stimulate our brains. But do they serve more of a purpose than just that? And I'd like to argue that they do. So let's talk again briefly about the history of folklore in human history. Folklore is really old. It goes back thousands of years, way back before there was writing or a written language of any kind. How people preserved their cultural identity and how people preserved their histories was through oral history, right? Through passing down of stories from generation to generation. Now, that in and of itself was pretty important to most people. But this becomes especially important once we start to see the population of the earth really start to increase, and we see cultures now starting to kind of come into contact with one another. When that contact happens, it's kind of a natural occurrence that there's certain elements of our group's culture that kind of disappears, and we kind of end up inheriting or latching onto other people's cultures, and they blend together. That's just a natural way of human interaction. Now, folklore stories, in probably the most important point here, is that it was a way for a lot of these cultural groups to preserve their identities. People started to figure out over time that as we come into contact with more cultures, with different cultures who have, different points of view and different ways of seeing the world, that we lose a little bit of our old identity, our old cultural identity. And passing on of these stories was a great way of preserving those. And a lot of these folklore stories have a lot of similarities from many different cultures across the entire world. Typically, what we see in folklore stories, just like we see in our favorite movies and in our favorite books and in our favorite TV shows, are relatable main characters, right? People who kind of, we can connect with, and we understand why they made the decisions they made and why they did the choices that they did. Folklore in especially, I'd say another main point of why it was important to people, because it was a way of reinforcing what was culturally important to people. And a lot of times those cultural significant characteristics were built into those relatable heroes and heroines. A lot of times it's the good traits of the heroes, right? They were courageous, they were intelligent, they were strong. That is what allowed them to succeed and to triumph over evil. And evil typically embodied the characteristics that a culture rejected, that said that these were bad things. So a lot of times the villains or people who were greedy or were power hungry, and those were traits that we as society was supposed to try to avoid at all costs. Otherwise you become a villain, you become a bad person in the story. So folklore in that regard had, at least two big purposes to it. It helped preserve cultural identity, like I said, and it helped to reinforce a lot of the cultural norms that were important to the people of the time period. And again, our main characters typically embody that in good ways and bad ways. So with that in mind, let's kind of get into the ghost story side of things. Now, ghost stories to me are a fascinating subset of folklore. And the main reason why I kind of say that is because we can trace the origins of ghost stories at least as far back as 900 BC, and probably even much further back in time than that. Now, why I find that particularly interesting is because when we're looking at different cultures around the world, even ones that didn't have any contact with each other, all have ghost stories, and a lot of their ghost stories have very, very similar characteristics to them, which in some ways kind of gives me goosebumps to say, because while I'm skeptical when it comes to the existence of ghosts, I can't explain that one away. I can't tell you why different cultures across the world who have never had contact with each other have very, very similar ghost stories, or people who have had very similar experiences when they describe having experience with a ghost or interacting with a ghost in some way. So that one, like I said, that one's still beyond me. I can't explain that. But when it comes to ghost stories, what we do see is some pretty common characteristics built into, like I said, cultures all across the world. Ghosts seem to play very distinct roles in stories, and it's usually one of maybe like 3 or 4 different roles. A lot of times what we see is ghosts are people who died and have not gone on to the next world. And one of the reasons why they're hanging around, it's hypothesized, is because they don't know that they're dead, and therefore continue to engage in the same daily activities and routines that they typically would have when they were still alive. Which is why you see ghosts, kind of wandering along on roads or in people's houses, and not really interacting with the live humans, but just continuing on with the activities that they would have done when they were still alive. Sometimes ghosts can be messengers, like what we see in A Christmas Story, for instance, when Ebenezer Scrooge was visited by the 3 ghosts. Sometimes we see that. Sometimes we see ghosts that seem to be guarding a particular area or some type of an object that is very, very valuable to them or was valuable to them in their lives. And that's why they don't leave a specific area, because they're guarding that thing that they feel like was very, very important to them. And sometimes, just sometimes, ghosts seem to just be purely malevolent, that they have a nasty streak to them. And their sole purpose here is to engage in evil actions. That seems to be the big 4 in terms of where we typically see ghosts built into folklore and stories in general. Now, with all of that in mind, what I have for us is a series of stories tonight. And again, the cool thing, like I said, is that they're all based in New Jersey. This first one that I have comes from your guys' neck of the woods. This one's in Warren County. I think that's the county below you. I'm not sure if anybody up there has ever heard of Shades Road. If you have, neat. I would love to hear a little bit about your experiences with it. But Shades Road over time has developed the reputation, or really, I guess I should say the nickname of being called Shades of Death Road. Now, there are a number of reasons for that. Shades of Death Road in Warren County, really the origins of that nickname goes back to at least the 1800s, maybe even earlier than that, probably the late 1700s. Now, if you've ever driven through Warren County, you'll know that it's pretty rural, right? It's pretty spread out. There's a lot of hills and mountainous areas, and there's a lot of pretty thick forests in the area. Now, as part of that, some of the main roads that go through Warren County are pretty windy. They cut through the forest, they cut through the trees, they cut through the mountains. And what that means in terms of them being really windy is that you don't always get to see really well in front of you when it comes to driving on the roads. They're windy, so they're difficult to see what's coming, in the not too, distant in front of you. Now, back in the 1700s, there were thieves and robbers who lived in the area of Shades of Death Road that used the windiness, the windy nature of the roads to their advantage. What they would typically do is hide around a sharp turn that people wouldn't be able to see them until it was too late for them. These robbers had a pretty dark reputation that they kind of seemed to take glee in violence and torturing the people that they were robbing. Many times they ended up murdering them pretty brutally. Now, that alone would be enough to give it the Shades of Death Road nickname, but it goes even deeper than that. Turns out that this road developed such a bad reputation that traders, merchants, travelers, people started to avoid this road altogether, to the point where it negatively affected the economy of the local towns. So the local townspeople decided to take matters into their own hands, went into the forests, they hunted down those robbers, and they killed and hung all of them along the side of the roads. Now, hanging those robbers had 2 points to it. First, it was to kind of let the travelers and the merchants know that it was safe to travel on that road again. But the other big thing here was to kind of send a bit of a message. Anybody else who ever thought of doing these horrible acts, like attacking travelers on the road again, this is what happens to them, that you'll be attacked by the townspeople and you'll be hung from the trees along the road, as an example. Now, fast forward much later in history, closer to the present day, people who drive on this road have reported many, many strange things happening. Probably the most frequent stories that you hear from this road today. People who are driving on the road will say that they'll hit a very, very thick or dense fog cloud almost immediately and seemingly out of nowhere. And this cloud makes it extremely difficult to see even, in front of you on windy roads that are already pretty difficult to see. Couple that with the fact that there aren't any streetlights on this road, and what you have is a recipe for some pretty dangerous driving if you're not being really careful. Many, many car accidents have happened on this road as a result, and unfortunately, some of them did end in fatalities. So other people who've had experiences in these fog banks have reported that as they were driving through the fog, that there were orbs of light that seemed to chase them pretty aggressively through the fog. And that once their cars made it out on the other side, the orbs seemed to kind of stay there in the fog and not chase the cars anymore. Now, what people kind of think that's been is that some people hypothesize that these orbs were the lost souls of the merchants and the travelers who were attacked and murdered on that road, trying to warn the cars that drive by that this is a very dangerous road and that they should take their time. Other people think that it might be the evil bandits, the robbers, who were hung along the side of the roads, chasing after cars to try to rob them, just like they did back in the 1700s. So whichever version of the story you choose to believe, needless to say, it's still a very dangerous road today in 2022, unfortunately. So if you ever find yourself on Shades of Death Road in Warren County, make sure you take your time. Take your time. It's not worth getting in a car accident for. Okay, so my second ghost story I have for you guys comes from Alpine, New Jersey. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Alpine, and I was unfamiliar with Alpine as well, it's right across the river from Yonkers, New York. So it's like really, really close to the city. Now, the origins of this story, the Devil's Tower, goes back to the late 1800s. A man named Manuel Rionda was a very wealthy planter and landowner down in the American South in the late 1890s. And he and his wife decided to move up to New Jersey for kind of like their retirement home. Now, as part of this move to New Jersey, Manuel decided to give his wife a surprise gift. And that gift was building this massive tower as part of their estate up here in New Jersey. Rich people problems, right? So, Why this tower was so important and why it was going to be a huge gift to her was because the tower was intentionally built high enough to look over the tree line so that she would have a gorgeous view of the city whenever she went up to the top of it late at night. And when she saw this tower, instantly fell in love with it, right? What a fantastic gift. She was absolutely blown away, loved it, loved her walks up there late at night. Could not have been a better gift. Now, some time goes by, and on one particular night, Mrs. Rionda woke up in bed late at night. She reached across the bed for her husband and found that he wasn't there. And that wasn't too unusual. She was used to her husband working late sometimes. So she decided to put on her robe and go for a walk to the top of the tower, her favorite place to go late at night to just kind of enjoy the peace and quiet and, get her view of the city. So while she was up there, she heard two voices emerging from the woods underneath the tower and recognized one of the voices instantly as one of the servant girls who worked, in and around the house during the day. Much to her shock and dismay, the other voice that ended up emerging from the woods was her husband. Now, this is, obviously her moment of finding out that her husband is having an affair behind her back. It's believed that Mrs. Rionda flew into such a rage of anger and depression that she decided to leap from the top of the tower all the way to her death. Now, in the weeks and months afterwards, after that incident happened, a lot of people who lived in and around this tower, or the servants who worked around this tower, reported really, really strange happenings. Some people said that if you went to the top of the tower, that you could smell perfume, and was the exact same perfume that Mrs. Rionda used to wear when she was up there. Other people who were at the top of the tower said that they felt a very violent, almost like a hand or something like that, pushing them towards the edge of the tower, almost like they were trying to push them off the tower, even when nobody else was up there. Still others who walked by the tower late at night reported to hear really creepy screams and growls, almost like a wild animal was in the tower. And what people came to start to say about this tower is that Mrs. Rionda made a deal with the devil when she leapt off the tower, that she, in exchange for her soul, made a deal with the devil so that she could come back as a ghost, so she could haunt her husband for the rest of his days as punishment for his infidelity. Now, clearly, Manuel Rionda is not about this, right? Doesn't like the strange screams that he hears late at night from the tower, doesn't like the fact that people feel like they're being pushed to the edge of the tower, decides to shut the whole thing down, boards up the tower as much as he can, won't let anybody go up there since. Sometime after Manuel died, the township took over control of the tower and decided that because it was kind of falling into disrepair, it needed to be deconstructed. It was the safest thing to do with it. During the deconstruction, though, there were more than one construction workers who ended up falling to their death while working on it, to the point that the township decided just to abandon the project altogether and just to leave the tower as is. Now, today in 2022, if you want, you can still go to this tower. This is an actual picture of the real tower. You can go to this. If you don't mind, I believe it's considered private property, so you'd probably have to trespass, but you can still do it. People who go there today in 2022 say that if you stand at the bottom of the tower long enough, that you'll be able to see creepy, dark figures kind of moving around the top of the tower late at night, and that some people can still smell that perfume come from out of nowhere. So Devil's Tower is another one of those interesting stories that still persists right up to today in 2022. Okay. My third story that I have for you guys tonight is referred to as the Pig Lady of Hillsborough. Now, if you don't know where Hillsborough is, it's maybe 45 minutes north of Princeton, so it's kind of central New Jersey. Now, as the story goes here, this one comes from like the early 1900s, 1920s, 1930s, somewhere around there. as the story goes, a farmer in the area of Hillsborough ended up having a child with his wife. And when this child was born, the husband's father took one look at this child and said it was the ugliest thing he'd ever seen, that it reminded him of one of his pigs he had outside on the farm, and therefore started referring to this poor girl, it was his daughter, as the pig girl. Now, clearly growing up in a house like that's not going to be good for you. About the only thing that really protected this poor girl from her, a mentally and emotionally abusive father was, the mom. The mom was really the only one that treated this child with any type of care or with, patience or kindness. Because the father was so ashamed of his daughter in terms of her ugliness, as he defined it, she wasn't allowed out of the house. So rumors became legends. Legends became, stories that especially teenagers in the area wanted to verify. People wondered. So on one particular day, maybe about 15, 16 or so years after the girl was born, two teenage boys walked up to the house and, as a joke, decided to leave a pig's head on the front door stoop. Both of their parents reported that those children never returned home that night. The police in Hillsborough launched an investigation, tried to find these boys, but nobody ever found them. Nobody ever found their bodies. Eventually, the mother dies, which leaves now this poor girl with just her father, who, again, as best we know the story, continued to be very mentally and psychologically abusive towards her, calling her ugly, calling her the pig lady. At some point, the father stopped showing up in public too. And that started to raise some questions and started to raise some alarms. Now, when the police eventually went to the house to investigate the mysterious disappearance of the father, what they ended up finding was an abandoned house. But when they went into the backyard, what they also found back there were some rather shallow and hastily dug graves. When they decided to dig up those graves, they found, first, it was the mother's grave that was very perfectly preserved. And it seemed like, by all accounts, the mother's body was taken very, very good care of. They also found the bodies of the two teenage boys that went missing, and they were pretty disfigured from the stories. They were cut up, they were dismembered. It was a pretty gruesome sight. What they also found was the grave of the father, who had been decapitated. And there was no sign of where the girl had gone. There was no sign of where the daughter went. So a lot of people kind of think that the girl disappeared somewhere in the woods, maybe in and around the house. Now, the reason why they think it's the woods around the house is because, fast forward to sometime in the 1970s or the 1980s, supposedly, a carload of 4 teenagers drove up to the house. I mean, the house was abandoned at this point. Nobody touched it. There was nobody else in the family that inherited the house. It just became abandoned over time. These 4 teenagers drove up to the house, to investigate the story, and as a joke, left one of them there and drove back down the driveway and up the road about a mile or so, leaving this poor girl, this teenage girl, in the dark right outside the house. About 5 minutes or so later, the car came back to pick her up, and everybody was going to do the "ha, we got you, we scared you" thing. But what they found when they came back was her running panicked down the driveway towards them. When she got to the car, they found that her arms were all cut up, like nasty, to the point where she needed to go to the hospital. They were trying to calm her down, trying to ask her what happened, but all she could do was scream. Couldn't say anything, couldn't get any words out, was just screaming. At some point, when she got to the hospital, she went into shock, treated for her wounds, ended up being okay, but never spoke again a day after that. So the only thing that people could come up with, the best guess, is that the pig lady continues to guard the house for anybody who might come to try to, molest the house or to do anything disrespectful. So today, 2022, people still believe the pig lady guards the house in Hillsborough. Now, this is one of those ghost stories from New Jersey that's steeped in a lot of history. So it's difficult to say sometimes, where the history ends and kind of the legend and the ghost stories begin, So the Proprietary House, and again, this is another one that this building's still very much still standing. This is a picture of the actual Proprietary House. You can go in here today in 2022, and this time you don't even have to trespass. So they still give tours of this place. You can go in there if you want to. It's considered kind of like a museum of sorts. So the beginnings of the Proprietary House go all the way back to just before the Revolutionary War in the 1760s, 1770s. The Proprietary House was originally built to house the royal governors of New Jersey, the ones who still served the British Crown at the time. Now, as an interesting side story to this, there is some even more local history attached in that Ben Franklin's son, William Franklin, actually served as a royal governor for the King of England at one point in the state of New Jersey, or I should say the colony of New Jersey at the time. Ben and his son William never saw eye to eye when it came to, wanting American independence versus continuing to stay loyal to the Crown of England. William Franklin, who again served as the governor of New Jersey for a time, always felt like his father was a traitor, that Ben Franklin was a traitor for, wanting the revolution, wanting independence. And those two never reconciled that difference between them. So interesting, like I said, side story to that. But what we do know is that when the Revolutionary War did break out, both sides occupied New Jersey at certain times of the war. Sometimes the British had control of New Jersey, sometimes the Americans had control of New Jersey. This house, because it was a pretty grand house and was built for the governor, oftentimes was used to kind of house dignitaries and generals on both sides, officers, important people for the most part. Now, what this house also had was a cellar down in kind of the basement. And what they typically used that cellar for during the war, and both sides used it this way, was to house captured soldiers on the other side. Now, anybody who's ever been down in a colonial cellar, especially the wintertime, you'd be able to tell me that it's pretty cold and it's pretty wet down there. It's dank, right? Definitely not some place that you'd want to have to, spend your days as a captured prisoner of war. Now, unfortunately, there are several soldiers on both sides that ended up dying as a result of their poor treatment down in the cellar. Some of them died from pneumonia. Some of them died from, just hypothermia. They really, really weren't treated well at all. Fast forward into the 18 and 1900s, lots of ghost stories have emerged from this house. A lot of people, and this is probably the biggest story that you hear from this house, report seeing a woman dressed all in white that seems to wander from the kitchen to the dining room and back again. Never acknowledges any humans around her. Often looks out the window towards the backyard as if she's like looking for somebody or waiting for somebody to come back to the house. People tried interacting with her. She does not acknowledge their presence at all, and then will disappear in pretty short order. Other people who've hung out in the dining room have reported to have felt almost like a hand grabbing the back of their neck pretty violently. And when they turn around, nobody's there. Probably the most notorious ghost story to come from the Proprietary House came around the 1960s or 1970s. Now, at one point before this building became a museum, it was actually kind of used as like a boarding home. You could rent rooms by the night. On one particular day, a U.S. Postal Service person, a mailman, went to the house to deliver a package. And when he knocked on the door, a 3 or 4-year-old child answered the door and invited the mailman in. The child led the mailman up to the 3rd floor of the building, and then, as the mailman tells the story, mysteriously disappeared. So, continued around the corner, and when the mailman went to, follow the kid was gone. Mailman started knocking on people's doors to find out, is this somebody's child? Kid's kind of wandering around the house. You might want to take care of them. But after knocking on several doors, came to find out that nobody living in the house at the time had any children at all. So that really kind of creeped him out pretty big. Today in 2022, there have been a number of ghost hunter groups that have gone through the house and said that they've gotten some really big spikes in the cellar, in the dining room and in the kitchen area. So those seem to be the real hot places inside the house. If you're interested, you can book, like I said, a tour. You can actually, I think, have dinner if you really want with your friends down in the cellar area. So if you do, anticipate maybe having a run-in with one of the ghosts in that building. Okay, so the Ghost of Finn's Point. This is probably the southernmost story of New Jersey that I have for you guys. Ghost of Finn's Point has details that go as far back as the Civil War, the American Civil War in the 1860s. Now, Fort Delaware had been built really right along the Delaware River in Salem County. It's literally right there. It's about as far south and west you can go in the state of New Jersey before you start having to cutting back east again. Fort Delaware was originally built in the early 1800s to protect Philadelphia and to protect the general Delaware River area in case there had any invasions in the future. I mean, we kind of learned our lesson from the War of 1812. The United States can be invaded from outsiders, and it's not a great thing. So they built Fort Delaware to protect Philadelphia and to protect the river. Now, fast forward to the outbreak of the American Civil War in 1861. And what they decided to do with Fort Delaware is to convert it to a prison in the North. Any Confederate soldiers that got captured, some of them would get sent to Fort Delaware, where they'd be housed for the remainder of the war. Now, Fort Delaware here starts to develop throughout the war a very, very nasty reputation. A lot of people started referring to it as the Andersonville of the North. Now, if you're familiar at all with American Civil War history, Andersonville was a prison that the Confederates had down in the South in Georgia. And Andersonville was notorious for its awful conditions that it kept Union soldiers in. I don't remember the exact number. I think it was somewhere around 15 to 20,000 Union soldiers lost their lives in that prison because they were starved to death. They weren't given hygienic places to go to the bathroom. They didn't have adequate housing, especially in the winter months. So the conditions were awful. It was just absolutely awful in Andersonville. So Fort Delaware, like I said, started to develop that reputation of being like the Andersonville of the North. Somewhere around 25 or 2,600 people from the South ended up dying as a result of the poor conditions that they were kept in at Fort Delaware. Now, all of those soldiers, when they died, seemed to have just been dumped into mass graves along the property and just covered up. That's it. So a lot of people who have visited Fort Delaware today have reported seeing, a number of ghosts walking around the mass grave sites, especially at night. There are ghost tours that go on Fort Delaware pretty regularly. So if that's something that's of interest to you, I know it's probably a bit of a hike for you guys, but they have a lot of ghost tours there. And people claim to have had a lot of encounters with ghosts down in Fort Delaware. If that wasn't creepy enough for you, on the property, I want to say it was back in 1993 or 1994, a mass murderer named Andrew Cunanan actually killed one of his victims on the premises of Fort Delaware. It was a groundskeeper who was there, and this Andrew Cunanan ended up murdering the individual and then stealing his car before he was caught, I think a few months later. So that just, adds to the already pretty creepy reputation that Fort Delaware has. Okay, so this one is an absolute classic. The Woman in White story is one of the universal stories that you can find in virtually every culture across the entire world. Almost every single culture makes references to a story of some kind of a woman that was dressed in white. The one that comes from New Jersey comes not far from Newark, New Jersey. Now, as the story goes here from Newark, there was a newlywed couple that had just gotten married that night, back in the 1950s, I believe it was. Now, on the night of their wedding, it ended up raining really, really badly. And you know how a lot of people say, you know, rain on your wedding day, it's good luck, right? Unfortunately, it wasn't for this couple. While they were driving back to their home after the reception, they ended up getting in a really nasty accident, head-on collision with a tree after the car kind of spun off the road. And both of the individuals were killed instantly. Now, in the months and years afterwards, a lot of cars, a lot of people who've been driving on the same road have reported to have seen a woman in white on the side of the road. Many, many stories of this. The one that I think sticks out to me the most, though, and to one to me that I think is one of the most creepy stories, comes from two teenage girls who were driving on the road in the 1980s. Now, as they were driving down this road late at night, they saw a woman in white on the side of the road and thought, you know, as most people would, that, you know, somebody's on the side of the road, maybe they need help. So these two teenage girls pulled over, rolled down their window to ask if the woman needed help. What they reported is that the woman, very, you know, straight-faced, no emotion on her face whatsoever, walked up to that window that was rolled down, got to within maybe a foot or so of the driver, and then opened her mouth to make it look like it was screaming, but no noise came out of her mouth. That was enough to scare both of the teenage girls to the point where the driver, you know, slammed her foot on the gas, car flies up the road. Couple miles down the road, once they had time to collect themselves, they decided that they needed to contact the police. They don't know what happened. Maybe there is somebody there who needs help, but at minimum, the police need to look into this. So once the police showed up, the teenage girls brought them back to the exact spot, and they were 100% sure this is the exact spot we saw this woman. And the police started to investigate the area. And after about 10 or 15 minutes of looking around, the police came back to those two girls and said, hey, listen, you know, we don't appreciate prank calls or anything like this. We looked through the entire area. There is no signs of anybody walking through here. There's no footprints. There's no broken, you know, branches or you know, passing through the leaves or anything like that. There's no signs of a human ever coming through here. Those two teenage girls doubled down on this story. I want to say it was like 6 or 7 years after the incidents. And by that point, they were into their mid-20s, were interviewed by a local newspaper about this story. And they said, you know, it's been a while since the story came out. Initially, do you guys have anything to say? Like, you know, do you want to retract your statement? Do you want to say it was all a hoax? Both of them said absolutely not, that they, you know, truly down to their very bones swear that this actually happened, and that was the most horrifying thing that had ever happened to them in their lives. Both of them refused to drive down that road ever since because it creeped them out that much, this experience they had with this woman in white. So if you ever find yourself late at night on a road in the Newark area, it's okay to call the police. Maybe don't roll down your window though, if someone does look like they need help on the side of the road. Okay, so my last story that I kind of have for you guys tonight is, again, another one that's steeped in a lot of history, a lot of history with this. Probably the most famous story is the story of the Jersey Devil. So what I want to do is to talk to you guys about the legend side of the story, and then I want to talk to you about the historical side of the story, because there's really a lot of both. So as the legend goes, down in Leeds Point, New Jersey, and if again you're unfamiliar with that, it's really right across the water from Atlantic City. So it's like right there. Leeds Point's still there today in 2022. It's a small town, but it's still very much there. As the story goes, there was an individual named Daniel Leeds who had a wife, and they had 12 children. And as the story goes, poor Mrs. Leeds here was sick and tired of having to take care of children, was sick and tired of having children, of being pregnant, of having deliveries. She was done with the whole thing. And she swore she was never going to get pregnant again because of it. Well, wouldn't you know it? When she found out she became pregnant with her 13th child, that was more than she could take. Poor Mrs. Leeds here ended up, you know, cursing her luck, and in particular, cursing the baby that was growing inside of her. Fast forward the 8 or so months later, and what we see is on one really, really nasty storm of a night, Mrs. Leeds went into labor. Now, what the people inside that room reported to have seen as part of this labor is that a very hideous creature emerged from her body that, as they described it, had the head of a goat, the leathery wings of a bat, cloven hooves, and a spiked tail. Very, very similar to what you see in this picture right here. It's like almost an exact, mock-up of their description. Now, once this creature emerged, flew around the room kind of panicky and ended up, attacking people in the room before it eventually broke through the window and disappeared into the Pine Barrens and in the rest of the state and the area. Now, hunters with dogs went out to hunt down this creature in the days and weeks after this happened. And the hunters claim that they found, mutilated animal bodies that were mutilated in a way that they had never seen another predator animal do before. That they saw cloven hoof footprints in the mud all around the area. And even late at night, they could hear the shrieks of this awful creature that, again, they never heard of before. Nobody was ever able to catch the creature. Nobody was able to kill the creature. And a lot of them believe that the Jersey Devil still exists in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey today in 2022. Now, that's the legend side of the story. So let's kind of talk about the historical side and how they are going to end up kind of blending into each other slowly over time. So what is interesting about this story, again, in my opinion, is that there really was a Daniel Leeds who really did live in what is today Leeds Point down in South Jersey. Daniel Leeds and his wife were a part of a Quaker group that lived in the area down in the late 1600s, early 1700s, so colonial time period in American history. Daniel Leeds and his wife did have 9 children, not 12 or 13, but still it's a pretty decent number of children to have. So that part of the story is relatively close. What we see is that what Daniel Leeds did for a living was publish almanacs, books that have key figures in it, makes predictions of the weather, what's the weather going to be like for the whole year, so that farmers could plan their crops and plan their growing seasons accordingly. One of the things that Daniel Leeds also liked to do as part of this almanac was to publish astrology, astrology signs, numerology, the occult, things of that nature. And clearly the Quaker community that it lived in was not going to be okay with that. So they warned him several times to knock it off with the astrology stuff, because that kind of went against what they believed in. Daniel Leeds wouldn't listen. It was seemingly really important to him to have that astrology in the almanacs. And it got so out of hand that the Quaker community decided to disown him. They made him a social pariah. They made him an outcast. And him and his wife were kind of cast out of society. Now, from Daniel Leeds' perspective, that was just fine by him, because it meant that he could really dive into the occult and the astrology and all this other stuff now. Continued to put that stuff in his almanacs, continued to sell them, and by all accounts, business-wise, did pretty well for himself. One additional thing that Daniel started to put into his almanacs as well was the family crest of the Leeds. Now, that family crest had 3 creatures that were called wyverns. They're mythological creatures that kind of bear somewhat a resemblance to this creature that we see on the screen right now. Wyverns had the body of dragons, the heads of what kind of looked like goats or some type of a goat-like creature, and had wings and a spiked tail. Very, again, similar to what we see on the screen right now. At some point, Daniel left the almanac business, to his son Titan, and his son Titan Leeds took over and continued to, publish the almanac with the astrology, with the numerology and the magic and the occult and everything else in there. Now, supposedly, at some point, Ben Franklin, a very young Ben Franklin, who also published almanacs as part of his business, looked at Titan Leeds as a business rival, somebody who published almanacs just like he did. Now, the fact that Titan Leeds was a big loyalist to England, somebody who thought that the American colonies should remain loyal to England, was something that really rubbed Ben Franklin the wrong way. And that seems to have put a target on Titan's back. So Ben Franklin started to say some pretty nasty things and spread some pretty nasty rumors about Titan Leeds. And one of the things that he started to refer to him as was the Leeds devil, because he believed in astrology and the occult and everything like that. The actual phrase New Jersey devil doesn't get published until much, much later in history. We don't see it until either the late 1800s or early 1900s in a newspaper. So prior to that, it was always just referred to generally as the Leeds devil. Eventually, it was a New Jersey newspaper that started to refer to it as the New Jersey devil or the Jersey devil. Now, where we kind of think the legend of the description of the creature that came out of Mrs. Leeds came from was the wyverns that Titan and Daniel Leeds put in the almanacs that, again, resemble exactly the creature that you see here. So that's kind of where we think the history and the legend of the Jersey Devil, like I said, kind of started to merge and to intermingle with each other. What I have here for you guys, and this kind of wraps our time up for the night, is an actual picture of the Leeds house that spawned the legend of the Jersey Devil, supposedly where the labor took place and where the creature emerged from. What's interesting about this house, and the reason why I'm the one who actually took this picture, I had to be kind of shady about it because this is a privately owned home that people still live in today. And my understanding is they really don't appreciate people stopping on the side of the road to take pictures of their house. So I kind of had to sneak it real quick. But this is the actual picture of the real Leeds house that still is in Leeds Point, New Jersey today in 2022. So that's what the house looks like. Okay. Those are my stories that I have for you guys tonight. Any questions? Awesome.